Hi, everyone. It's Don. Because Principles of College Teaching is not meeting this Tuesday, we're going to do your questions from your reflections from week 8 over this video. So I have a list of your questions. I'm going to give you my answers to these questions. As always, if you have questions, follow up with me, and I would love to have a further conversation. So here we go. So the first question we have is, what best ways can an instructor make their course accessible to students in the classroom? Are there obvious ways of knowing when an instructor is providing too much accommodation without being considered inconsiderate at some point? So the first part of this question, best ways to make your course accessible, is to think ahead and proactively remove any barriers that are getting in the way of your students either learning or demonstrating the learning in your class. So try to make the information that you're sharing with them uh, presented in a way that they're going to be able to digest and understand. Try to make sure you're using a number of examples. Try to get the information out in a number of forms if you can. And try to be as inclusive as you can. Offer the opportunities for them to ask you questions, offer the opportunities for them to give you feedback and to interact with your students in real time if you can, to make sure that you're keeping them as caught up as you can. So just proactively be empathetic in your delivery of information and in the checks that you do with your students. The second part is, how do you know you're doing too much accommodation without being considered inconsiderate at some point? I think when you ever get to a point where what you feel like you're being asked is unfair and way beyond what accommodations the student is entitled to according to the Student Access Center, I think that's where we're getting just a little bit of that gray area. I like to err on the side of being too accommodating rather than less accommodating if I can help it. And I think communication with the student about what the student needs to be successful in your class is something that you should invite. So meet with the student, talk with the student, find out what they think they need, use the Student Access Center to provide some guidance and facilitation if you need to get that student where they need to be. And there's going to be a lot of accommodations this week because accessibility was a topic. Second question, connecting to our previous discussion of microaggressions, how would you respond to students receiving accommodations experiencing microaggressions from their peers? This is an interesting one. I can't think of an instance where a student has experienced microaggressions in my class because of their accommodations, because I don't make those accommodations public. This is typically a situation in which I'm interacting directly with the students to provide those accommodations. So I've not ever experienced that. However, if I did notice students were experiencing microaggressions, I would confront it just like I would do any other kind of microaggression based on race, gender, sexual orientation, gender expression, or identity, or any of those other kind of things. And I'd let them know that that's not going to be something that's appropriate. But because I do my accommodations personally with the student and no one else needs to know about it, it's not a situation where I've had to deal with that. And I do completely recommend that you respect the confidentiality of your students who need accommodations and don't make it public to their classmates. Third question. I'd be more interested in hearing more of my or Tucker's experiences accommodating students with special needs. Did certain strategies to accommodate work better than others? The typical accommodations that I'm dealing with in my classes are student needing extra time on exams, which is pretty easy to do. And Dr. Maysberg Tomlinson talked about how you can do that. There are quiet rooms. If you're doing an online exam, it's real easy to add extra time. Extended deadlines, that's really easy to do. Not employing late policies to students with accommodations, not penalizing them for attendance, which is sometimes an accommodation that people do. I've worked with students who are blind, students who are deaf, and I've not really had many issues. I've just kind of worked with the student and with the Student Access Center to kind of provide for them what they need. There is a situation, I'd made reference to this in our conversation last week, where there is a student I'm dealing with now, where it took us a little while, where that student kind of wanted to dictate more of my teaching practices than I was willing to have that happen, because those teaching practices were important for the SLOs of my class. I was trying to develop skills that were important in my class, and the student wanted to develop different skills. Student Access Center got involved. We had a conversation. They facilitated my conversation with the student. I had a conversation with the student directly as well. Now we're on the same page. And I think the student just felt better about, rather than me just saying no, we had a conversation about what I was trying to do and how I was trying to do it. And then we worked on some compromises that got the student more comfortable with doing in my class. So I think that conversation, that empathy piece, that communication piece worked even in the hardest situations I've ever had to deal with. But typically, it's not that stressful as an instructor to deal with the accommodations, because I'm hoping you, like me, really want your students to succeed. And I think that accommodations are a fair way of doing so. Next questions. How do you approach a student who needs to know about the SDS without calling them out as struggling? Um, I think one of the things we've got to do is we've got to let our students know about student access services and things like that. And just saying, hey, if you have a situation that requires accommodation, use them. And I always recommend if a student has accommodations, use them. It's not an unfair advantage. It's not something to be stigmatized. It's something that makes it more equitable. It makes it more fair for you to learn and demonstrate your learning in my class. Next question is, how would you knock down barriers that are apparent because of money and capitalism? Um, I try to make sure that my students have access to the materials in my class. I try to make sure they're open resource. We use little videos. I use open source stuff. I write the readings in some of my classes. I use open source textbooks to try to remove that kind of monetary barrier, because I am aware that if I have a $200 textbook in my class, some students might not purchase it, and that might put them at a systematic disadvantage. So I think kind of using open source materials and providing resources to students that way is one way that I try to get around kind of socioeconomic differences among my students. And the next question is, how can we get more or better transcript technology? That is a great question. It's something our Student Access Center is working on. And I wish I had a better answer except to say that they are working on it, and hopefully we'll get there. A lot of the free services that we have are not great. And a lot of stuff that we pay for is either very expensive or not very quick. So we are continuing to work on options to get us where we need to be in terms of transcription. Next question. Thinking about mid-semester check-ins, how can we work with students that have serious concerns we're unable to change? Yeah, sometimes students will say, hey, this is a big issue I'm having in your class, and it's a central component of my class, and I can't change it without changing what my class actually is. And in that case, I try to provide support to my students. I try to provide recommendations. I try to make the information more accessible to them. I try to support their success. I also try to make it explicit about why that's integral to my class. Next one, what resources are available to faculty members who may have disabilities? That is an excellent question. To be honest, I'm not sure. What I would do in a situation like that is I'd reach out to the Student Access Center and ask them. But I, very fortunately, from a position of privilege, have never had to exact the services for myself. So I honestly don't know. But the Student Access Center would be the first place that I would ask. The next question asked, if a student has temporal physical inconvenience, like a broken arm, but never asked for special treatment, should he or she be treated the same as other students? Well, I'd say that that student, he, she, or they, I would reach out and say, hey, y'all good. If you have a broken arm and it's your writing hand, what can we do to help you out with writing tasks in my class? Do you need extra time? Do you need someone to kind of to transcribe what you orally dictate or something like that? So I would ask the student, is there anything we can do to help out? And I think letting the student know that you care about their success and you are reaching out. And if that student said no, I would say, well, keep me posted. If there's ever anything that you think you can need, anything to help you out, my guys, please reach out. We'll try to help you out. Having that empathetic response and providing what you can for your student is something that I always advocate. Next question. Do you think shifting to an online platform has made your class more accessible to your students? If so, would you consider continuing in a hybrid mode even if things return to normal? Yes, I do think an online platform has caused me to think more about the delivery of my content. And I've tried to deliver my content in more ways. I've tried to make my content more digestible to my students. I've tried to make it more inclusive. I tried to be more proactive in thinking about what students are dealing with when they're viewing my content, especially if I'm not there with them, if they're viewing it asynchronously. So I do think teaching in an online mode has made me a better teacher in many ways, including making my teaching more empathetic and more inclusive. Would I consider teaching in a hybrid mode even when things return to normal? Yes. For instance, next semester in my department, I think I'm the only one teaching high flex. I'm the only one who's going to be having classes where I'm going to be in person, but people are going to have the opportunity to Zoom in. I really think globalizing education, breaking down barriers that we might have for physical proximity or our comfort, going to a face-to-face class as a pandemic continues, globally. Yeah, I think I am going to try to continue to teach high flex as long as I'm able to. It does require some more support. And one of the things that I've kind of asked is if I get to do this, I want a really good teaching assistant. People like Tucker and Noah Rankin have been my teaching assistants and they've shepherded me through this. And I need to have people who are going to be able to help me through this as we continue. But I think teaching in a high flex environment is going to expand the reach of our education. And I'm very interested in our doing that. Next question. When you teach a student with a disability, what was the most challenging thing to care of him or her? How do you address this issue and how did you see any improvement points? I was in constant communication with students, and like I said, I don't think I've really ever had a negative interaction. Like I had a couple of challenges this semester, but even now we're good. I think communication, working with the Student Access Center, finding out what the student's perspective is, so they can work with he, she, or them to get them where they need to be educational in my class. I think that communication piece and the empathy piece, that's going to get you where you need to be, and it's going to help your students learn. Next student, how can we proactively remove barriers for students who might not come to us with their concerns or requests for accommodations? And there's a number of questions, so I'm going to answer the first part. Think about what it would take to be a student in your class and make it as easy as possible to get the information. I'm not saying don't be challenging. I think being challenging is important, but don't be inappropriately or unreasonably challenging. So think about the best way that you can to let your students know how to succeed in your class and present your material and your content in a way that allows them to do that. So that empathetic perspective on what your students might be doing, apply it to the design of your course. Has there ever been a time in which I reached out to a student because I thought accommodations might help them, or is it standard for students to approach the instructor first? I would say it is standard for students to approach the instructors first. I wouldn't technically know which students to reach out for accommodations, but I let all of my students know, or at least I try to let them all know, I want you to do well. And if you ever have a situation, reach out to me and we'll see if we can work with it. And oftentimes the people who reach out, they don't have a technical accommodation. They're not dealing with a specific learning disability, but they have a situation where I can apply to empathy too. Maybe they need a little bit more time. Maybe they need a little bit more guidance on an assignment, and I'm happy to provide that. So I think I try to be empathetic to all of my students and let them know that they can reach out to me for anything. So I'm proactive in offering the invitation for reaching out, but I don't typically reach out to students. I do sometimes will send them an email, say, hey, haven't seen you in a while. Hey, Simon didn't come in. Is everything okay? And then the student can follow up with that. But I don't typically reach out for a student to let them know about accommodations because I wouldn't even know they were entitled to them unless they reached out to me first. Next, what changes have you made to your own teaching in person or on Canvas to make your courses more accessible for students? So I've talked about this a little bit before, but just to remind you, I've tried to kind of really look at the course design and to make sure that the content is going to be something that's accessible for my students, especially if I'm not there. So I've tried to work on clarity. I've tried to make the format as inclusive and accessible as it can be. What changes have been easiest? I think some of the changes that have been easiest is really streamlining things. And I think this is easiest because streamlining things and making it really, really hard to mess up makes it easier for students and it makes it easier for me. If my assignments are easier to figure out and succeed on, they're easier to grade. So I think kind of the streamlining, the prioritizing, the focusing on clarity has really been important in making my classes better. Which has been most difficult, and how do you overcome those difficulties? I think the most difficult part, and we're kind of seeing this now, is sometimes our contact is not in real time. Sometimes our contact is asynchronous. And that makes it harder for me to gauge my students' learning in the moment so that I can get in front of any confusion. Sometimes I'll mess up. I'll just say something wrong. You know, I won't be clear. I'll mumble. I get excited and I talk too fast and I mumble. In real time, I can see students get confused. I can't do that if we're asynchronous. And even if we're synchronous and those videos are off, it makes it harder for me to do it, which is what inspired the Zoom policy that I use in this class. And which difficulties do I think are most important and why? I think those difficulties where I can't help my students in real time, I can't necessarily gauge their learning, those have been the hardest. And those have been the things that I am most ambivalent about actually in continuing to teach HighFlex, because I am aware that some of my students will be less engaged in my class as a result. But some of my students may need to do that to take my class at all. So I'm trying to weigh out both the positives and the negatives of that decision as I continue. I'm trying to make education generally as inclusive as possible, but I am aware that there might be some disengagement for students who can't take it in real time with me synchronously. All right, on the page. Next question. The first time you teach a class, it can feel overwhelming to enact all the little changes that make a class accessible. Yes, it can. Even if we believe those changes are important and empathetic, what advice do you have on how to prioritize certain aspects of accessibility under time constraints? I think the first thing that I would kind of think about is again, Student Access Center has a lot of resources out there to kind of help us with this. They can actually look at your web pages for your Canvas pages. They can look at your materials and let you know whether or not that's going to work or subtle changes that can be made to make things better. So I'd use those resources and not try to kind of invent everything from scratch, because you don't have to. There are specialists and experts that help us with this. We have instructional designers all over campus that help us with these kind of things. So my first bit of advice would be to do that. The next thing I would do is there's some real easy things. Number one, posting things as Word docs instead of as PDFs, that makes them a little bit more user-friendly. There's ways that you can label hyperlinks with titles rather than just by the web address itself. They're going to make things easier if someone's using a document reader. using, instead of red, burnt orange for people who might be colorblind, to kind of to pick up the salience that you want that information to have. So there's a lot of little things that you can be doing with that. But I think just making sure your information is as clear as possible, streamlining, as I've talked about, those kind of things to make it more accessible for everybody. And when you make your courses more accessible, it doesn't only make them more accessible for people with learning disabilities, for instance, it makes it more accessible for everybody, and it makes your teaching more inclusive and more empathetic. Next question. I think recording lectures is a great idea that improves accessibility even after the pandemic is over. I agree. We've talked about how some students stop coming to class with PowerPoints are posted online. That happens. Do you think recorded lectures might pose the same problem? Absolutely. One of the things that makes me ambivalent about posting PowerPoints and why I don't is that when I post PowerPoint, students don't come. So what I do now in my HighFlex classes, I post the class recording of the entire thing for later viewing. So if they're not going to be there in real time, at least they're going to hear me. Even if they speed it up, which they should never do, because as I've said a number of times, I already talk at 1.5 speed. So if you're at least watching, you're getting a little bit more of that experience rather than just going in the PowerPoints and thinking you can learn from my PowerPoint slides, which is not the case. If I'm not there explaining them, if I'm not there providing examples and articulation, elaboration, more information, it's going to be really hard to learn from that. So I try to post the videos, not the PowerPoints. And I think it's better than nothing. And it is something I will continue to do after the pandemic because I think it's inclusive. It makes education more accessible. But I am ambivalent about the opportunity for students to avoid attending in real time to watch those asynchronously later, because I do not think that is the same experience. I think it's a better experience than having no experience, but it is not the same experience. All right, last question. On Thursday, we talked about how to build access for students with disabilities on the university and instructors level. But sometimes, in order to support students with disabilities, other students in the classroom may also need to make some accommodations. How can we build an inclusive environment in the whole class while avoiding publicly talking about the student's disability in class? This is an excellent question. One of the things that I often talk about when I talk about prejudice, and I realize this is analogous to the situation, is I say, if there's a social problem, you have a choice to make. You can be part of the problem or you can be part of the solution. And I always invite my students to be part of the solution. So if there were ever a situation where my class climate or something in my class had to change to accommodate a student or a couple of students with a disability, what I would do is I would say the change we're making is going to help all of us learn. And I want to be someone who promotes the learning of everybody. And I'm sure you want to be someone who promotes the learning of everyone. We call this a consistency appeal in social psychology, works on the premise of cognitive dissonance and self-perception. But if I say, I'm sure you're the kind of person who empathetically wants to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to learn in class, people are more likely to say, yeah, I want to be that person. And then what you can do is you can enact the accommodations that you would do. So I haven't had this situation happen in my class, but that's how I would appeal to it. Is I would appeal to their sense of empathy, their kind of connection, their classroom community, and say, it's important to do this so that all of us can learn in a fair and equitable way. As you heard me say last week, I think equity is more important than equality because I want everyone to have the opportunity to succeed in my classes. And as always, these were wonderful questions this week. Like I said, in the interest of time, we're doing this over video, but if anyone has any follow-ups, I would love to hear them. Can't wait to see y'all on Thursday. And until then, I hope all is well.